It's a pleasure to be here. My talks here at Stanford are part of a book project centering on 4 manuscripts that each contain a manual, unattested elsewhere, as far as I can tell, for the making and use of Buddhist talismanic seals. 3 scrolls and a small booklet, all held today in Paris at the National Library of France. This is the booklet. My talk last night focused on seals as religious objects and as ideas and metaphors found in religious practices. It was drawn from an in-process chapter of the book that tries to answer the question, just why seals? Why would seals have been chosen as the center of a ritual program in this period? What were the places of seals and ideas of seals in Chinese and Asian religious practices more generally? This evening, I turn my focus to the manuscripts themselves and to their fuller programs, beyond simply the seal manual they share, and present a small part of some work that attempts to answer a different sort of question. That is, what can we learn about the conventions of ritual practice and what we might call liturgical composition that went into them? And here I don't only mean the composition of the seal manual, but the composition of the larger programs and collections found on the manuscripts, of which the manuals were but one small part, one module, if you will. Now here you see 2 of the manuscripts, Pelio 2153 on the top, and the verso, or the back, of course, of Pelio 2602 beneath it. They contain, to my mind, quite different kinds of ritual collections. Pelio 2153, or just P 2153, appears to have been what people in manuscript studies sometimes call a miscellany. That is, its component texts do not appear to form a single discernible sequence or program. They seem instead to have been, if you will, a palette of rites available perhaps either to an individual ritualist or to a lineage of ritualists. For example, we see here a segment of the seal manual I mentioned, and then further down the scroll, a collection of talismans and seals found, like the seal manual, in various forms on a range of other manuscripts at Dunhuang. The scroll, again, appears simply to be an anthology or a collection of ritual texts of the sort, sometimes, but not very helpfully really, characterized as Buddho-Taoist. The verso of P 2602, on the contrary, appears to my eye to have contained an unfinished ritual sequence, perhaps even a single unfinished ritual text, though whether unfinished in composition or simply in copying, it is impossible to know, since this particular sequence does not occur elsewhere, at least not at Dunhuang or in transmitted collections. Just FYI here, the scroll appears intact and finely made, that is the paper, intact and finely made. Its recto or front contains a scriptorium quality copy of a passage from the Taoist compendium, the Wushang Biyao, dated Kaiyuan 6 or 718. Its colophon notes that it was commissioned on behalf of the ancestors of 2 Daoshi of a local Taoist temple known as the Shanquanguan. The text on the back was clearly inscribed long after this date. It's an especially fascinating scroll, though I don't have time to talk about it in any detail here. Here is a section towards its front. As you see, it also contains some native Chinese Fu talismanic glyphs, though here they are incorporated rather seamlessly into the larger logic of the text as a whole. Here we see towards its end a couple of examples of why I say it was never finished. First, some titles of seals, though whether stamps or hand mudras, it's impossible to know since the images were never added. And here, some titles of altars, quote unquote, again, lacking the images we find elsewhere on finished portions of the manuscript. Now, in previous work aimed at trying to understand the conventions of ritual composition seen on these manuscripts, I've looked specifically at the texts found on them and tried to trace their connections on other manuscripts and in transmitted literature. In that work, I try to show, among other things, that the programs were, in a sense, improvised out of available materials, a practice in which short ritual texts and sections from transmitted scriptures were treated as modules that could be mixed and matched, at least to a degree, as needed. Details could be changed to fit the programs being constructed. I call this modular improvisation. Here I'll talk about a newer phase of this same work in which I step away, as it were, from these particular manuscripts and their texts and try to understand conventions of liturgical composition both more narrowly and more broadly. More narrowly in the sense that I'll focus here on how rites for the chanting of texts were composed, and more broadly in the sense that I'll broaden my coverage to include not only manuscripts, but also excavated xylographs or block prints found at Dunhuang and Karakoto, and indeed to some extent in transmitted ritual literature as well. Okay, let me now dive into the paper that I've prepared for you. Focusing on rituals for the chanting of Buddhist scriptures and spells, my presentation here today tries to begin to answer the following simple question. What do the structures and contents of Chinese manuscripts and xylograph liturgies, primarily but not only from Dunhuang, suggest about the nature of the ritual cultures in which they were produced? Toward this end, I examine three features of these liturgies. First, the natures and frames by which texts were made the focuses of recitation rites. Second, the borrowings and adaptations of existing materials of which those frames were made. And third, the understandings of the nature of scriptural language implicit in these practices. Now, chanting texts has, of course, always been at the center of Buddhist practice. Transmitted and excavated evidence both make clear that in the case of scriptural texts, they were rarely, at least in China, they were rarely simply chanted by themselves, without any textual or ritual frames of the sorts that I'll be talking about here. The Dunhuang evidence further suggests that the grand liturgies found in the transmitted canons, whether in the form of incantation scriptures or the ritual programs associated with the eminent monks, typically with the eminent monks of the great monasteries, were not followed strictly, at least at Dunhuang. I say this because few of these texts appear among the manuscripts in forms suggesting they were chanted in the forms in which we are familiar with them from the later printed collections. Instead, new liturgical frames were created, usually with the following simple and I think very familiar structure. First, invocation and invitation. Second, the recitation of empowering prayers or spells. Third, the main event, that is the recitation of a scripture or an incantation. And finally, a closing act of some kind, often further spells and or the announcement of merit gained and directed. Perhaps because they were not associated with famous priests or high monastic lineages, and likely because of their sometimes idiosyncratic natures, the manuscript versions of these basic practices examined here were only very rarely included in the transmitted collections that have made up the main textual sources for the Buddhism of this period. Though evidence from both Dunhuang and Karakoto makes clear that certain of the liturgical forms found on the manuscripts were indeed later printed. And the printed Diamond Sutra, famous as the world's so-called earliest printed book, the first sheet of which is now available for your viewing at the Getty down in Los Angeles, in fact bears an abbreviated version of the liturgy that, for the chanting of the sutra that I'll be talking about in a moment. Not just the sutra itself, as it sometimes seems, as you would sort of get the sense, reading catalogs and things. This fact, along with a range of other evidence, both excavated and transmitted, strongly suggests, at least to me, that the Buddhist cultures that produced these ritual forms made up significant parts of the history of Buddhist practice in this period. Yet, until the Dunhuang manuscripts were discovered at the turn of the 20th century, it was to a great extent a lost history, in China at least, glimpsed mainly in tale literature and in the sometimes disapproving comments of monastic censors. New studies of these materials and of others found in Central Asia and China, and more, of course, those in newly available Japanese temple collections, reveal a richer Buddhist, and not only Buddhist, but Taoist, Manichaean, Christian, and popular religious history in the 9th and 10th centuries, and indeed through to the 13th century at least, than we had previously known about. Now, Buddhist ritual practice at all levels, from that of the grand liturgies of the elite priests of the capitals, some of which, as I said, entered the transmitted traditions of the imperially printed canons, to the smaller and relatively ephemeral devotional rites preserved on manuscripts and xylographs at sites like Dunhuang, in part centered on the construction of new frames for popular cultic figures, such as bodhisattvas or protective deities, or texts, usually incantations or narrative scriptures. These new frames enabled new forms of worship, healing, protection, and spiritual transformation. To take one example, new ritual programs were written to fit an existing incantation into an originally unrelated ritual system, or to integrate it into new styles of ritual enactment, such as mental eidetic contemplation, as opposed to simple visual contemplative regard, a phenomena that, as Koichi Shinohara has, of course, recently noted, was perhaps especially central to the growth of esoteric Buddhism, not only in Buddhist China, but in India before it. To take another example, new programs were put together in order to tap, as it were, and make more widely available the cultural potencies of a widely revered spell or scripture. It's these latter practices that I want to focus on here. I'll explore two aspects of the making of such ritual programs: the creation of new ritual frames and the adaptation of existing texts and parts of texts in this process. The Dunhuang ritual xylographs and manuscripts allow us to examine these practices at various stages of development. And this is especially true of the manuscripts, I think. The single sheet xylograph liturgies I'll mention were by nature finished products. Whatever processes led to their composition are lost. Many of the longer manuscripts and their later xylographed editions, in contrast, allow us to examine the composition of rites in detail and offer insights into how those who composed them, and for my purposes here, I'm just going to call them ritualists, understood the natures of the texts they adapted and the language of those texts, as well as the ways they could be reframed and to an extent remade according to local needs. The printed iconic liturgies were single sheet devotional programs, apparently distributed by, and this is a guess of course, distributed by monasteries and the printers they either controlled or patronized. Some were quite simple, for example, narrow sheets printed with an image of the Bodhisattva Guanyin, his name, and the single sentence, "Make 1,000 vocal offerings every morning with a pure mind," unquote, meaning, I think, chant the name of the Bodhisattva 1,000 times every morning to the image on the xylograph. Others are more elaborate and larger sheets in 2 visual zones. And I think these will be quite familiar to many of you. The upper zones contain an icon of a Buddha, Bodhisattva, or protective deity, while the lower have texts prescribing somewhat more complex ritual programs centering on the icon, typically including a spell and a description of the powers of the rite. The rituals prescribed in these xylograph sheets naturally did not vary over their many instances, a well-known feature of printed texts, of course. What was carved on the block, assuming skilled execution of the print, was repeated perfectly in every impression made of it. Further, we have no evidence, at least in this material, that those who received and presumably enacted these rites improvised their own versions based on the sheets. None of them contained handwritten notes, reading marks, or changes of the kind common on manuscripts. Though, though as always, we must be very careful about arguments from silence or from limited evidence. The xylographs, from their carving on the blocks to what we can see of their reception, suggest something like a top-down or perhaps center-out style of ritual practice in which all devotees, at least in theory, practiced in precisely the same ways, following the programs prescribed by the temples that had the sheets printed or distributed. The composers of both the printed and manuscript liturgies discovered at Dunhuang, however, were alike in that they treated the received textual and transmitted traditions as something like raw material to be reframed, altered, and otherwise reworked according to their own styles and needs. Of course, one can also find versions of this attitude in transmitted literature. I think here, for example, of the ways, as Peter Gregory has shown, that Zongmi rather freely reworked ritual manuals associated with Zhi in his own ritual compositions. But the greater variety evidenced in the manuscript liturgies allows us, I think, to see more of the processes of adaptation and improvisation that lay behind finished products such as the xylographs. Doing so gives the sense of a much more open and relatively centerless style of Buddhist ritual practice and liturgical composition, in which ritualists saw themselves as having considerable freedom in what they could borrow, adapt, and juxtapose. This is one of the primary themes of the larger book from which this work is drawn. This talk is drawn, I should say. Here, I examine two versions of a basic liturgical structure for the framing of cultic texts in Chinese Buddhist ritual seen in the Dunhuang material. The first I call internal, and the second external. The key differences between them are the sources of the paratexts that make them up and the relations of those paratexts with the main text. In the first style, described here in cases of chanting spells drawn from scriptures, specifically liturgies for the Da Bei Zhou, right, the incantation of great compassion, central elements of the paratexts were internal in the sense that they were drawn from within the main text itself, and in fact served to remake the scripture that they were drawn from into more briefly and perhaps more focused chantable form. The paratextual frames of the second style are seen here, that is in a little while, that is, in cases of chanting scriptures as wholes. Though they came in history and convention to have close practical relations with the central cultic text, they were wholly adventitious to it in the sense that they had no inherent relation to its content and did not serve to rework its structure. They were drawn entirely, as far as I can tell, from external sources, and the cultic texts they reframed remained more or less whole and intact. For examples of this style, I take very briefly a liturgy for the recitation of the scripture of the incantation of great compassion as a whole, that is rather than just the spell, and in somewhat more detail, a program for the chanting of the Diamond Sutra. We begin by examining the texts that frame the incantation of great compassion in certain of its liturgies. As a case study, I take the version included on a scroll that's 259 centimeters in length, held today in the British Museum, where it is known as Stein 2566, although more on that number in a moment. I'm afraid it has not yet been digitized, so I cannot show you a picture of it here. Luckily, a typeset edition is included in the Taisho collection of scriptures, where it has the number 2843, T2843, of course. I have consulted this edition for this talk. But I should note there is some disagreement about what the original Stein number is. The Taisho editors say the original was Stein 2560, while the synthetic edition of Dunhuang Manuscripts, published not that recently, in China, says that it's 2566. I tentatively follow their numbering here, pending a trip to the British Library to find out which is right. The manuscript also contains a copy of the liturgy of the chanting of the extended version of the Foding Zunsheng Zhou, right? What I translate as the incantation of the glory of the Buddha's crown, the Ushnisha Vijaya Dharani. The Dunhuang Index reports that a colophon at the end of the scroll announces that both of these texts had been copied in a place called the Guanyin Inner Chapel of the Sanjie Monastery, the famous Sanjie Si, of course, near Dunhuang, by a monk named Huiluan. Interestingly, for our purposes here, Huiluan, that is, refers to both liturgies simply as dharanis, or incantations, suggesting perhaps that their liturgical settings had come to be seen, at least in certain contexts, as to an extent built in to the incantations themselves, at least in terms of their reception in a way. Now, the Great Compassion liturgy begins with an interlineary note, itself adapted from the scripture, telling the devotee that before he chants the spell and its accompanying invocation, he should prepare himself by contemplating and vocalizing the name of the Buddha Amitabha 3 times with a focused mind. Then follows the invocation, incantatory prayers, and assertions of power drawn from the scripture itself. I'll read you here my tentative translation. First, the invocation. We beseech Guanzi Zai of the moon wheel, his vast, perfect body of purple gold, his 1,000 arms always outstretched into this world, his 1,000 shining eyes ever illuminating all, his 1,200 spells and gestures fulfilling the prayers of all beings, his face peaceful with its 3 eyes and pervasive majesty, bearing on its brow Amitabha with his jeweled scepter. Speaking holy spells and their mystic teachings, he realizes in full the awakening of Buddhas. His intelligence utterly unimpeded, he saves humans and gods. Among all bodhisattvas, he alone is chief. Catching even the faintest strains of his incantation, one is cleansed of one's karmic dust and sand. Chanting it, one completes the causes of Buddhahood. The power of the great compassionate one's vow is inconceivable. Thus, we chant it in praise. Next comes an adapted scripture. That was not from the scripture. This next part is from the scripture itself, the sutra itself. It's very repetitive in structure, each made up of couplets, right? The first line of each couplet goes, veneration to the great compassionate one, Guan Shi Yin. I won't repeat that part. I'll just repeat the second parts, just to give you a sense of what it says. May we swiftly comprehend all things. May we soon attain the eye of wisdom. May we swiftly save all beings. May we soon attain skill and means. May we swiftly board the ship of insight. May we soon pass beyond the ocean of suffering. May we swiftly attain the way of ethics and meditation. May we soon scale Nirvana mountain. May we swiftly gather in the hut of the unconditioned. And may we soon become one with the body of the Dharma nature. Then it switches gears a bit. If we encounter the mountain of swords will break. If we encounter the bath of flames will vanish. If we encounter hells, the hells will wither. If we encounter hungry ghosts, the hungry ghosts will be sated. If we encounter the evil hearts of Asuras, they will of themselves be vanquished. If we encounter beasts, they will of themselves attain the great wisdom. Unquote. Now this text, which was put together from various sources, note, for example, that the Bodhisattva is named both Guanzi Zai and Guan Shi Yin, which elsewhere usually marks separate ritual or textual traditions, contains most of the features of invocations and the texts that extend them that are relevant to my investigation here. It begins with the devotional invocation of the deity, focusing on his attributes, his golden body and 1,000 arms extended to save beings in the world, and especially the many spells associated with him. Next, in a passage drawn from one translation of the incantations scripture, it moves to assertions of the miraculous powers of the chief of these spells, which those engaging in the rite will soon chant. Finally, it gives a set of prayers and ritual assertions taken from the same translation of the scripture that contains the version of the spell to be chanted. To paraphrase them in brief, again what I just read, we worship the Bodhisattva, may he grant us blessings, and after chanting his spell, we will be so powerful that should we be reborn in either a hell or in the realm of hungry ghosts or animals, those conditions will shatter of themselves. Then follows the dharani itself, after which the frame is closed with a final section called the transferring the blessings of the dharani, which takes a form that will be familiar, of course, to many of you. Quote, may the blessings of this recitation pervade all sentient beings. May we and all beings accomplish together the Buddha way, unquote. Thus, a version of the standard frame of Buddhist ritual is created, or a standard frame, is created. Spells are invited spirits are invited to empower and protect a space for the enactment of the cultic object. Here, a single sovereign figure is invoked, the Bodhisattva Guanyin, but as we will see in other cases, a number of lesser divinities are called upon instead. Next, devotion to the objects and its powers to fulfill the desires of the participants is asserted. That object, here the dharani itself, is then brought forth within this new divine realm. Finally, the success of the enactment and its blessings are announced, and those blessings are sent into the world to transform it. Now, the second part of the Dunhuang liturgy for the incantation of great compassion, the framing expression of devotion and desires, is, I think, particularly revealing of the method, which is my main concern here, of course, by which new ritual programs were made. It consists of a quotation from a translation of the incantation scripture attributed to the 7th century monk Bhagavad Dharma, and examining the passage in its original context, in the scripture itself, of course, we see that the composers of the new rite stayed true in general terms to the dictates of the scripture. In it, that is in the scripture itself, the Bodhisattva teaches that all those who wish to practice his incantation must make this set of 10 petitionary or aspirational prayers, or vows, yuan in Chinese, all of which, as we see, take the form of veneration to the great compassionate one, Guan Shi Yin, may we quickly accomplish X. Right, now a quote. Should any monks or nuns, male or female donors, boys or girls, wish to chant and keep this dharani, they should arouse the mind of great compassion and kindness within them and make the following vows along with me. Right, that is the vows I read. The Bodhisattva further instructs that immediately following this recitation of the vows or the prayers, those who would chant this dharani should next, quote, call out my name with full concentration and then wholeheartedly contemplate my root teacher Amitabha, the thus come one. Then they can properly chant this dharani incantation, unquote. So the makers of the liturgy reproduced on Stein 2566 appear to have treated this portion of the scripture's ritual instructions as a module that could be lifted from its scriptural context, and with the addition of an invocation and an announcement of blessings as framing bookends, taken as a standalone ritual program. The liturgy provided a way to carry out the primary ritual action of the scripture, that is, of course, the chanting of the incantation itself, in the way that the scripture prescribes it. The importance of this particular practice in Chinese Buddhist history is I think, impossible to overstate. With the exception of the simple and ubiquitous recitation of the name of the Buddha Amitabha, it became, according to Junfang Yu, the single most widely enacted practice in all of Chinese Buddhism. Indeed, for this reason, Yu has characterized its source text, the translation attributed to Bhagavad Dharma, as, quote, by far the most important of all the esoteric scriptures in China, unquote. Though this version of the scripture as a whole did circulate in something approaching complete form in the period treated in this talk, at least 6 manuscripts found at Dunhuang contain all or parts of it. The abbreviated liturgical passage centered on Stein 2566 had life of its own as a ritual module in a geographically region stretching from Dunhuang through the Chinese cultural heartland to Japan. It is featured, for example, in a ritual manual for the chanting of the incantation attributed to the early Song Dynasty Tiantai priest Zhi Li, and in a late Japanese printed edition dated 1801 of another manual for the chanting of the spell attributed to the 8th century priest Omogavajra, but otherwise unattested, that is said to be held at the Hasedera temple in Kamakura, Japan. Okay, that's internal frames. Now let me move to external liturgical frames. Frames for the chanting of scriptures in their entireties appear to have been much simpler. Here I have manuscripts, so I'll show you some pictures. When the scripture for the incantation of great compassion in something like complete form is found in liturgical settings on Dunhuang manuscripts, for example, on the booklet known as Stein 5460, it is set up by a simple invocation-like prayer, called here Fa Yuan Wen. The manuscript is no longer complete, and I have not yet been able to find the rest of it in any of the Dunhuang collections. But it appears that it once held the entirety of the scripture. As it stands, following the brief opening prayer, it gives the title and translator of the Bhagavad Dharma text, then provides most of the opening section of the scripture with a number of apparent scribal errors, miswritten characters, and occasional line omissions of the sort familiar from manuscripts. Through the 10 vows that I read out earlier, up to the line, quote, if we encounter the bath of flames will vanish. The prefaced Fa Yuen Wen goes as you see it on the screen, and here's my tentative translation. We bow our heads to the lords of the triple world, endless Buddhas of the 10 directions. Now we make our great vow to chant this scripture of great compassion. Above the treasure of grace for our grave sins, below salvation for those suffering the 3 dark paths. All who experience the chanted scripture, I think, will express the vow to awaken. Exhausting this single karma-given body, we will be born together in the land of ultimate bliss. Unquote. Now, simply in terms of its content, I think you will agree that this is an utterly conventional Buddhist ritual statement. What makes it important for a study of ritual framing and modular improvisation is that it is also found, with one important difference, as the introduction to a liturgy for the chanting of the Diamond Sutra contained on the manuscript Stein 1846. This is a scroll. The difference, of course, being that at the key moment, it doesn't say to chant this in scripture of great compassion, it says to chant this Diamond Sutra. The prayer, at least in its basic structure, appears to thus have been part of a common store of texts that ritualists drew upon in order to fashion new ritual settings for the main cultic texts of the tradition. Turning to the setting for the diamond on Stein 1846, invocations and spells drawn from common stock, and most famously, a set of previously minor deities, the 8 great diamond spirits, or the Ba Da Jinggang, who came to be closely associated with the scripture in its ritual enactments. Given their importance and unique historical connection with the diamond liturgies, I will focus on the use of this last set of figures and texts, taking them as emblematic of the structural differences between what I'm here calling internal and external frames. I won't read all of that to you there. Though they have only faint presence in the transmitted tradition of printed canons, the 8 great diamond spirits, as is quite well known, I think, to those of you who look at Dunhuang stuff, were prominent in Buddhist practices of the Dunhuang region around the turn of the 10th century. They are paired with the scripture on a number of manuscripts, all but one of them liturgies, and are painted as well as named on at least 3 manuscripts. Jai Fengda, or the famous Jai Fengda, I should say, a locally prominent official and lay Buddhist practitioner who was a productive patron of the religion at Dunhuang, copying numerous sutras and overseeing in the year 925 the reconstruction of his family's ancestral Buddhist cave shrine known today as Cave 220. Attached a text to a copy of the diamond that he had made that is the sole non-liturgy among the manuscript sources for the 8 figures, at least as far as I know. It makes clear the importance with which Dunhuang locals, or at least Jai himself, viewed the connection between the diamond spirits and the scripture it is in their nature to protect. The text, which Jai may have compiled and not merely copied, is the record of the spiritual efficacy and blessings gained from the chanting of the Diamond Sutra, a collection of tales extolling the miraculous powers of the sutra. After the tales are 2 more texts concerning the potency of the scriptures and the proper manner for its enactment. The first is Hymn on the Blessings Bestowed by the Diamond Sutra, composed by the Kaiyuan Emperor, verses attributed to the Tang Emperor Shenzong, and finally an untitled prescription for the chanting of the diamond that features the 8 great diamond spirits. The final portion of this text begins, anyone who wants to chant the Diamond Prajnaparamita Sutra must first invoke the names of the 8 great diamond spirits, be of perfect sincerity of mind, and only then chant the sutra. These 8 great diamond spirits will come to protect those who chant the sutra. The text then gives the standard list of 8, along with their powers and principalities. I bring a preliminary translation back to the screen here. Now, it's rare, in my experience anyway, to have direct evidence that ritual prescriptions like this one were actually carried out in history. But as we have seen, a number of the liturgies in fact feature the 8 great diamond spirits in precisely the place that Jai's text said they should be. Stein 1846, which you'll recall bears the invocation found in slightly different form, also within the the incantation of Great Compassion liturgy on Stein 5460 is one of the most complete. Its chanting program, echoing Jai's own preface to the diamond, begins with a legend of the scripture's history in China called the Preface to Great Master Fu's verses on the Diamond Sutra. This text was said to have been drawn from a semi-legendary commentary to the Diamond Sutra attributed to Fu Da-shi, Great Master or Mahasattva Fu, a layman who, legend tells us, was responsible for the conversion to Buddhism of the famous Emperor Wu of the Liang dynasty, this kind of emblematic patron of the religion in Chinese history. The text, though as far as I know, does not survive in any Chinese transmitted edition, clearly achieved a degree of popularity well beyond Dunhuang. Aside from Stein 1846, portions of the text survive in Uyghur translation on manuscripts from Turfan, and a Chinese version was listed by the 14th and 15th century Korean monk Gihwa as one of the 5 principal commentaries known to him on the diamond in his Commentaries of 5 Masters on the Diamond Sutra. Immediately following this text in the program on Stein 1846 and elsewhere is the injunction quoted a little while ago that those who would chant the diamond must first invoke the 8 great diamond spirits. Following this, before their 8 names are 2 spells. The first is a mantra in 15 syllables called the mantra for the purification of spoken karma, which you have there, a kind of if you'll allow me, a kind of spiritual palate cleanser intended to rid the chanter of the ill effects of past misdeeds committed with words. The next is called the mantra of offerings to the Bodhisattva Shukong or Akashagarbha. Anyway, you have it there. What comes next is an especially interesting example to me of the kind of adaptation of classical sources common in these materials. After the statement, Yun He Fan, which is difficult to interpret, but perhaps means something like, one asks, how do you chant it? The liturgy contains lines on the diamond-like or vajra-like nature of the Buddha's true body, originating in Dharmakshema's 5th century Chinese translation of the Mahaparinirvana Sutra. In its original context, the lines are the first in a series of questions asked of the Buddha by the Bodhisattva Mahakasyapa. And here's the quote. I ask, how did the Buddha attain his immortal state, his diamond-like, indestructible true body? By what means did he attain the power of great solidity or perfect reality? I ask, how can one completely reach the other shore of liberation, that is, by means of this sutra? Would the Buddha open the sublime gate and explain it for all beings? Unquote. On the manuscript, after this quotation, the nature of the diamond here, which is of course not only the Buddha or his body, but more importantly now the text, the Diamond Sutra, of which it is now an emblem on the manuscript, is asserted and further clarified, which leads to the prayer I showed earlier, again adapted, it seems, from common stock. Let me read it again, just because I like reading these things. We bow our heads to the lords of the triple world, endless Buddhas of the 10 directions. Now we make our vow to chant this Diamond Sutra. Above, the treasure of grace for our grave sins. Below, salvation for those suffering the 3 dark paths. All who experience or hear and see this chanted scripture will express the vow to awaken. Exhausting this single treasure body, we will be born. Treasure body, wrong one. This karma-given body, that's from a different translation of a different manuscript version. We will be born together in the land of ultimate bliss. Now, by this paratextual language, in my view anyway, legend, prescription, assertion, incantation, and prayer, all of which we might again characterize as external or adventitious, in contrast to the internal or intrinsic language featured in liturgies of the incantation of great compassion, shorn of its sutra, the scripture at the heart of the rite here was framed as a cultural object of great power. Back to the liturgy, this one, it next has the ritualist seal the space, that is, enclose the space, or seal it really, in which the rite takes place. The invocation of the diamond spirit protectors of the action and its object is introduced with the simple title, Invitation of the 8 Great Diamond Spirits. Actually here it's just the 8 diamond spirits without the descriptive great. Then the 8 are named and characterized in precisely the words seen earlier, though without the final assertion of the lordship of each figure. Added to them here without comment or introductory title are invocations of 4 further bodhisattvas, the Jinggang Zhen, the Jinggang Suo, and the Jinggang Ai and Jinggang Yu. After this 6-fold preface, at least as I count it, comes finally the main event itself. That is the chanting of an edition of the Diamond Sutra as a whole. After giving its edition of the scripture, the liturgy then closes with 2 sets of texts. The first consists of 3 verses that appear to be unattested elsewhere, although I'd be very grateful if anyone has seen them anywhere else. One each for the 3 natures of reality, described usually, of course, in consciousness only, Buddhist philosophy, the imagined, the dependent, and the perfect. The second are 3 final spells that, as Neil D. Schmidt has noted, in slightly different versions close out other Diamond Sutra liturgies, as well as Jai Feng Da's edition of the text. The 3 spells, each shorter than the last, are named the mantras of the great body, of wish fulfillment, or Sui Xin, and the heart of the heart, or the Xinzhong Xin. So, okay, now some words by way of a conclusion. In the scriptures of Buddhism and in its devotional rites, the words of the Buddha are asserted to be inviolable, to be sacred, supremely potent, the very essence of reality itself in many cases. In such ritual contexts, they are to be worshipped and worshipfully reproduced as perfectly as possible. They cannot be altered, edited, or otherwise treated as normal human speech. But this view of language is largely, I think, an achievement of staging or of simple assertion in the case of scriptures. Behind the curtain, as it were, in the practices of Buddhist ritualists, another view of these words is suggested. In these practices, the speech of the Buddha was, by necessity, I think, fully open to transformation, reframing, and reuse. Props, in a sense, employed to stage the real, and kept afterwards as the makings of new and different performances later. These practices, at least for me, always recall Evans Pritchard's famous description of the contextual transformations in a newer religious practice of, quote, the sacred pole associated with God, the spirits and their lineage, and also with its ghosts, unquote, back into just an object on which you can hang things in the corner of the room. Now, such a view of religious language, which is widely suggested on Dunhuang Buddhist liturgical manuscripts, and especially, I should say, in the kinds of manuscript liturgies with which I began this presentation, that is the ones I mainly work on, these manuscripts containing the seal manuals, things can get quite mixed and matched there, was inherent to the work of the ritualists whose job it was to stage and restage the potent cultic texts of their tradition in ways appropriate to the needs of the moment, or the lineage, or the, etc. It is only when properly framed, of course, as I said a moment ago, with language, behavior, bodies and objects arranged carefully in space, that words spoken or inscribed take on the kinds of heightened status that they have in religious practice. Beyond what they suggest about the nature and conventions of Buddhist ritualist practice in the China of the 9th and 10th centuries, the preliminary investigations of this study, I think, or I hope, also shed light on the history of this practice in Buddhist China and beyond. First, the manuscripts, as so often, appear to be evidence for an important layer of Chinese Buddhist history that was largely ignored, or anyway, is not found, in the works of the compilers of the transmitted, that is printed, often with imperial support, of course, textual tradition. But with closer examination, we can begin to see further details of this history. Though the practices explored here were often strongly local in character, at least in origin, that is shaped by the particular needs of their times and client populations, we have seen that they were not entirely local. At times, indeed, there appear to have been close connections within a far-flung body of Buddhist manuscripts and block prints stretching from Dunhuang to Japan, some of which constitute our earliest editions of Chinese Buddhist texts. Strikingly, these connections in certain cases appear to have been closer than were those linking the manuscript and the imperially printed editions, which have typically been taken as the standard and best editions of texts in Buddhist East Asia. Such evidence suggests that the subterranean, if you will, history of ritual practice and textual transmission glimpsed in the Dunhuang liturgies was important indeed. Again, though it is far beyond the scope of this study, comparison of its preliminary findings with those of Koichi Shinohara's recent book, Spells, Images, and Mandalas, Tracing the Evolution of Esoteric Buddhist Rituals, which explores very similar, I think, cultures of ritual practice and composition in India in great detail, suggest the possibility that the local, or what I'm calling the local culture of ritualist craft sketched here may, in fact, have stretched across Buddhist Asia. Thank you very much for your attention.